Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. Today we're going to do a review of the AYANEO Pocket S. This is a top-of-the-line Android-based handheld, and it's kind of a follow-up to a previous video I'd made before, where I got my hands on an early prototype and I tested a bunch of stuff in terms of controls and screen. But in this video, we're going to focus mostly on performance, benchmarks, battery, all the kind of things that I couldn't test because the other one was so early. In addition, there have been some updates from the prototype version to this one, and so we will also retest things like the controls and see what the final build quality is going to be like. Now, the Pocket S is superlative in many ways. It has a very premium feel to it. It's probably the sleekest Android device on the market. In addition, it's also the current most powerful Android device as well. And as you've probably guessed, it's also the most expensive. The early bird pricing on Indiegogo starts at $400 and climbs up from there. However, there are many elements to this handheld that are not superlative, to the point where they undermine my overall gaming experience. And after a week of testing, I can say that the Pocket S is an amazing handheld that I just don't really enjoy using. As you can imagine, we've got a lot to unpack here, so grab a snack and drink, and let's go ahead and get started. Okay, as always, we'll start with the specs, and I went over most of these in my impressions video, but I do want to do just a quick reminder. So this is running the Snapdragon G3X Gen 2. This is actually the first device released with this chipset. And as of making this video, that's the top-of-the-line chip that you can get for a gaming-focused Android device. It comes with LPDDR5X RAM in 12 or 16GB options, and you also have a number of different storage options, starting at 128GB all the way up to a single terabyte. Now, in terms of display, it does get a little bit complicated. So all of them will be 6 inches, and everything that you order now will be 1080p LCDs. However, when the campaign first launched, there was a limited number of 1440p displays, and those have now all sold out. So as it stands, I'm just going to treat this like a 1080p display throughout my testing in this video, just because that's the only one that's now available. Now, this comes with a 6,000 mAh battery, and I got a lot of questions about what the battery life was going to be like with the final model. And with Android devices, it's always difficult to say these are the specific hours of battery life you're going to get, just because it can vary a lot. But I will say that my average is about 7 hours, so let me give you a good example of that. Here I'm playing Genshin Impact with high settings on and 60 frames per second in the medium or game setting performance mode. I've got it set up with a highly sophisticated mechanism that will keep the game running for an hour straight. And over the course of running this game at a 75% brightness, I lost 14% battery. And if we do the math, that means it's going to be a little bit over 7 hours of battery while playing it at this standard. And so yeah, I think the battery life on this is great. If you were playing something a lot more lightweight, you would get even more than 7 hours out of it. And of course, if you tried to push it all the way to the max, it would be a little bit less. Moving on, let's talk about weight. So this is 358 grams. We'll do a weight comparison later in the video. Now, in terms of connectivity, this has got the works. So Wi-Fi 7, Bluetooth 5.3, and it also has DisplayPort 1.4, which means that the USB-C port can be used for video out. The device comes with Android 13 and has a couple other features, including halt triggers and analog sticks. Now, in terms of pricing, this is not cheap. Right now, under early bird pricing, it's $399 for the low spec model, but will go all the way up to $629. And the highest spec model is what they're calling the unmarked edition. This means they've removed the AB and XY labels on the buttons. I'm not sure it's worth an additional $70 to remove those button markings, but hey, it's your money. Also bear in mind that these are only the early bird pricing, so if you try to buy this thing in a month or a couple months from now, it's going to be a lot more expensive. For example, at official retail, the cheapest option is going to be $560, and it'll go all the way up to $769 for the unmarked edition. And so yeah, no bones about it. This is a very expensive Android handheld, the most expensive I've ever seen. So let's do a quick unboxing and see what we get at that price point. To start, this is a review unit sent over from AYANEO. All opinions are my own, and they're not seeing this ahead of time. Of note, they did send me the top-of-the-line model. So this one has the 1440p display with 16 gigs of RAM and a terabyte of storage. But as I mentioned, I'll do all my upscale testing at a 1080p resolution just to have a standard baseline. Anyway, inside the box, in addition to the device, we will get a manual as well as a USB-C charging cable, and that's it. So let's actually check out the hardware itself, and I'm going to go through this fairly quickly just because I've tested all this before in my previous video. But first impression here, man, this thing is very sleek. I love the fact that it has a full glass panel, even though it is very reflective. I also love that they sent me the white colorway. I didn't like the black one getting so smudgy, and so this is a perfect solution for me. And the material on the back feels great. It's semi-glossy and is really great grippy with your fingers, and so I think that's nice. Also, in terms of appearance, I love the fact that it has that metal band around it because it makes it look very premium, much like a flagship phone. Otherwise, as far as I can tell, all of the I/O is the same. We'll go over it really quickly here in a minute. But before that, I want to check out these controls because I had quite a few notes from my previous video. First and foremost, one of my biggest disappointments about this device initially was that it has the same Nintendo Switch style Joy-Cons. And sure enough, yeah, they haven't changed out these analog sticks from the preview model that I tested a few months back. Now, these are Hall effect sensor analog sticks, which means that they're going to have a pretty good input, but they just don't really feel that great. Especially considering that other handheld manufacturers like AYN and Retroid have already developed small handheld joysticks that feel really great. Now, in terms of the physical input, it seems to be the same as it was with the test model. So it has a circular input, and then also there's quite a big dead zone. And as I demonstrated in my previous video, these can be adjusted in the software. So no big deal there, at least when it comes to the inputs. But for such a premium device, I wish they had also upgraded the joysticks. In fact, when I made my last video, I made a wish list about 4 things I wish they would change before retail release. And as you can see, number 1 on this list was that they improved the analog stick experience, and it doesn't look like they've changed it at all. So when it comes down to it, I think that these analog sticks are functional. You can definitely play a first-person shooter game with it, but it's not necessarily something that I would really enjoy. Like I had mentioned in my review, it's very similar to trying to play a AAA game like this on a Nintendo Switch Lite, because they are very similar. And AYANEO has been using these same exact sticks for quite some time now, and I've been bringing it up into my other videos where the premium quality of these devices have been upgraded, but the sticks have not. And so I do think that an analog stick upgrade is overdue, especially if they're trying to push this premium factor. Now, the second item on my AYANEO Pocket S wish list was that they would add some pivot to their D-pad. In my previous testing, I had found that the diagonals were a little bit too easy to press down on, and so I thought that the D-pad needed to be raised up a little bit, so that way there was a little bit more height and so you could pivot into those diagonals. And in testing the D-pad now, it does seem like they have made a change. It's hard to say without having both of them in hand, but it does feel like the D-pad is raised up a little bit more. However, it still has a relatively flat feeling to it. You can definitely press down on any of the cardinal directions and even a diagonal, but when you're trying to rotate it like a pivot, it doesn't seem to actually work. And so if anything, it still feels a little bit on the mushy side, especially when you're trying to roll a diagonal. And it's pretty easy to see this when you're using a gamepad tester app. You can hit the cardinal directions no problem, and if you hit the diagonal just perfectly with both like the bottom and the side at the same time, yes, you can hit a diagonal as well. However, when trying to roll from one cardinal point to the other, you will find that there's never really a point where they are both highlighted. And that's what I mean in the fact that you can't really pivot or roll this in a really effective way. Let's try a couple real-world examples to illustrate my point. So we start with Contra here. If we press down on the D-pad and rock it left and right, you can see that the character almost never moves. And this is the opposite of what it was previously, where the character would move too much. And so for the most part, yes, I would say that they fixed the accidental diagonal problem, but it does seem like the pendulum has swung a little bit too far in the other way. It is still possible to hit a diagonal when you want to, but it does require some deliberate effort. If anything, it reminds me a bit of the Logitech G Cloud, which is a device that also had some pretty hard diagonals. And we can also see this with a Capcom-style fighting game like Street Fighter 3. In this kind of scenario, you want to be able to hit a diagonal anytime you want to. It's supposed to be pretty easy, so that way you can do a Hadouken and Shoryuken. And as you can see, it is possible, but it does require some deliberate effort. I think it is something that you could probably acclimate to after you get used to the idea of just kind of mashing it down to hit the diagonal, but it is a disappointment that it's not very intuitive. You have to be very deliberate about it in order to make it work. So I would say A for effort in the fact that they did try to improve the diagonal and it is a little bit better, but I would say they didn't totally stick the landing. Okay, moving on, let's try out these face buttons. I remember liking these a lot, and yeah, these are almost the exact same experience. They have a rubber membrane connection, so they feel nice and bouncy, and the shape and size of them is pretty similar to something like a PS Vita, but a little bit more rounded on top. So I definitely like these face buttons and I have zero complaints here. I think that they are really good, if a little bit small. Now I did get some questions from people asking of whether or not they would be able to swap out with PS Vita buttons. And so here's a quick measurement. It is 7.38 millimeters for the AYANEO Pocket S and 6.7 for the PS Vita, so not swappable. And while I have the Vita out, it is a good time to kind of demonstrate the fact that these are very similar devices in terms of look and feel. This is the 1000 series of the PS Vita, which also had a glass front to it, and yeah, I think it looks amazing. And you can definitely see that same design aesthetic here with the Pocket S. Now also on the front, on the left bottom side, we have our start and select buttons, and then on the bottom right, we have our AYANEO button and a programmable function button. And then finally up top left, we have our home button. Now these are a little bit weird. If you actually look in the manual, it is labeled as a home button, but the interesting thing is that the custom function buttons, which are also on that bottom right, but then also two up top, these actually don't have any sort of customization option within the software right now. I hope this is something that'll be fixed before the retail units ship, but at least as of right now, the software is not ready yet. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself, so now let's look at the top and look at those actual buttons. And you can see them right here on the edge of each of these shoulder buttons. They do have a function, but they are not programmable right now. Anyway, also up top, we have our exhaust vent here on the left, then a microphone input and an LED indicator, and then our volume up and down, and then our power button, which is a fingerprint sensor. Next, we're going to test out the shoulder and trigger buttons, and these feel exactly the same as they did previously. So the shoulder buttons are easy to press down on and have a nice bounciness to them, and then the trigger buttons are Hall effect and have a little bit of travel to them, but still feel really good. The thing that's unique about these is that they are at an angle, so instead of pressing down on them or pressing them from the side, they kind of go in a 45-degree angle. Either way, I do like these trigger buttons. They're nice and shallow and easy to press down on, and I think it still gives you a good range of motion. Okay, looking at the bottom, we have two stereo speakers. We'll test those in a minute. And then also we have our exhaust intake here in the bottom. And then finally our USB-C port and then another microphone input. Of note, there is no 3.5mm headphone jack on this device. On the left side, we have a micro SD card slot, which leads me to the next point of my AYANEO Pocket S wish list. And that is number 4, that I had hoped that they would add an LTE module so you could add a SIM card and then be able to use it on the go or even as a phone. Given the fact that this thing is so much like a flagship phone, it almost feels like the next logical step. So unfortunately, yeah, that's not going to be an option with these retail units, but I hope it is something that they would do in the future because I think there's still a market for people who want to use a handheld like this as their primary device. And finally, on the right, we have a physical toggle for the performance modes. We'll go over this more in detail later in the video. Before we move on, let me talk about the other thing that was on the wish list that we haven't addressed yet. And that is that I had hoped that they would include a front case for this device, given the fact that it is so sleek and premium, I didn't want it to get damaged. An example I gave was a 3D printed case that you can find on Etsy for the Retroid Pocket devices. This one's kind of neat because it doubles as both. On the front, it'll protect everything and still make it easy to pocket, but then also you can flip it around to the back and it becomes ergonomic grips, and I think this is a pretty good hybrid solution. Now, I already knew that they were making an ergonomic case, so that's definitely something that's still happening, but it does look like they've added something else, and that is a protective case here on the front. Now, this is a second piece to the case, so if you take it off, you're going to have to find somewhere to stow it. I would have rather had something that's more of a hybrid, but I do like the fact that they were thinking about covering up the front. Moving on, let's do a quick recap of size and weight comparisons, even though I did that in my previous video. If you remember, this device is slightly wider than a Switch Lite and a little bit shorter as well. It's also a little bit smaller overall from the Odin 2, which is a similar high-end Android device. We're going to see a lot of the Odin 2 here later in this video. We got a whole section comparing the two. And finally, as always, here is a reference with my OLED Steam Deck, just so you can see the size difference between the two. Now, in terms of weight, this is something that I wasn't able to show in the previous video, but you can see that my unit is 358 grams. That makes it about 60 grams heavier than the 1000 series of the PS Vita, as well as the Nintendo Switch Lite. And coincidentally, it's about 60 grams lighter than the Odin 2 and the Switch OLED. Now, in terms of pocketability, this device is super slick and thin, but those analog sticks as well as those triggers do get in the way of making it fully pocketable. You can definitely fit it in a regular pants pocket, but just bear in mind it is quite a long device given the fact that it has controls on either side. So it's not the same experience as putting a phone into your pocket. In addition, getting it out of your pocket can be quite a pain given the fact that those analog sticks are pretty grippy and will stick to your pocket liner. So I would say in terms of pocketability, it's pretty close but no cigar. Now in terms of ergonomics, this is a very flat feeling device, so there's no real place to put your hands, you just kind of have to push them against the back. And like I mentioned in my previous video, it is almost identical to the Nintendo Switch Lite in that regard. It's a very flat feeling device. For my part, I would rather have a little bit of an ergonomic bump. It doesn't have to be a full grip like a Steam Deck, but even something like the Odin 2 really nails it. This gives me plenty of leverage to be able to hold both sides with all of my fingers, and it feels a lot more comfortable for me. And so yes, I'm a big fan of having nice ergonomic grips on a handheld, and I would prefer something like the Odin 2 over the flatness of the Pocket S. Now, of course, bear in mind that the grips on the Odin 2 do make the device quite a bit thicker and a lot less pocketable, but it's a concession I'm willing to take. Okay, so that's about it for hardware. Let's move into the software side and just talk about the software suite once again. Bear in mind this is an Android-based device, and so when you boot it up, it is pretty much like an Android phone or tablet. You install your apps and then launch them. Now, AYANEO has a couple mitigations in place, including what they call AYA Space. And this essentially is an Android-based front-end launcher that can use either Pegasus or Emulation Station to collect all of your games. However, I found it to be pretty limiting to get set up in the first place, and there's not a lot of customization here. Instead, I would recommend using a third-party solution like the full Emulation Station Desktop Edition. I made a couple videos about this already, and it's really easy to set up, and the nice thing is that once you have it set up, you can transfer it over to other devices. So for example, in this scenario, all I did is I took my Odin 2 SD card and I moved over all my ROMs as well as my Emulation Station files into the internal storage of the AYANEO Pocket S. After that, all I had to do was just point Emulation Station to the correct folders and everything was good to go. That means that all of my settings and my preferred emulators and configurations, my favorites, my scraped box art, all of that carried over and it worked perfectly. So this is just one of the many benefits of using a third-party app like Emulation Station. It really streamlines the experience. Now, also within the software, they have what they call AYA setting. And here you can change a couple settings, but I have to say the options here are pretty rudimentary. For example, under the lighting section, all you can really do is just change between different solid colors. And there are other options that you can do with these LED lights in other settings, and we'll go over that here in a minute. But it is kind of weird that within the AYA settings app, you don't have the same options as you do elsewhere. Same thing with the controller section. You would think this would be the ability to maybe map those custom function buttons, but no. All it allows you to do is recalibrate your buttons. And really, that's about it, other than in update sections. You can go in and update all of the software like I have already, and you can also just enter the regular Android settings. Now, the rest of the options come within the AYANEO quick menu by pressing the button on the bottom right. This will allow you to do any number of things, including changing out the performance modes. We have 3 different options. There is balanced and gaming as well as max. Anytime you set it to the max mode, it's going to give you a warning that says that it's going to drain the battery pretty quickly. And of note, each of these performance settings will also adjust the fan automatically, but you can also go in and change that yourself too. We'll do a fan audio test here in a moment as well. Also within the settings, we have a performance overlay, and then also within the control section, we've got a bunch of different options. Here we can adjust the rumble strength as well as the sensitivity of the triggers and analog sticks. You can also swap out the AB and XY pattern to be either Nintendo or Xbox style as well. Further down in the settings, we have the ability to adjust the brightness and the volume, but then also the RGB lights. And here these settings are a little bit more robust, at least in the fact that you can change them between a rainbow RGB cycle. Now, also within these settings, they have a key mapper function. You have to have a game running in the first place, but after that, when you toggle it on, it'll give you this interface. And the setup here is pretty intuitive in that you just kind of drag the button to where you want it to be and then assign the button accordingly. However, I did find it to be somewhat limited, especially when it came to adding the analog stick controls, because you can't actually see them and use them at the same time. And so it does become a lot of guesswork in terms of where to place the analog stick input and how large it needs to be. So if anything, I would say that the key mapper function is definitely there, but it is somewhat limited. Next, let's do some screen and sound testing. We'll start with the screen and we'll put it to the lowest setting just to see how dim it can get. And I gotta say, this might be one of the dimmest screens I've ever seen. In fact, when I put it at the lowest setting, it's really hard to see even in the dark. So I think if you're really trying to play in a pitch black environment like in bed, I think this might be ideal. In addition, we have a pretty good range between the very dimmest and very brightest setting. It gets relatively bright, maybe not the brightest in the world, but I do like the fact that we have a lot of choice here. In terms of max brightness, I would say this is definitely something you could play in the shade, but not under direct sunlight. So I think the best way to describe it is that yes, you could play this in a car, for example, with a roof over your head so you've got nice shade, but you wouldn't want to take this to your son's baseball game in direct sunlight because it's just too hard to see. So if anything, I would say the screen is pretty great, just not exceptional, at least when it comes to the brightness. Next, let's do an audio test. This is at 100% volume in an untreated room. And I got a request for this song in particular, so let's roll with it. So I got a few notes. The first is that I think the audio quality is not half bad. These speakers are downfiring, which means they're not going to be super crisp and clear, but I still enjoyed myself when I was playing with it. The second note is that yeah, this song is awesome. I need to play this level more often. And finally, my third note is that bird is a pain in the butt when you're trying to play this game. Okay, next let's do a fan noise test. This is at the max setting using the default fan. And overall, I would say this is quite noisy. In fact, it is louder than I thought it would be. Let's do a comparison between this and the AYANEO Odin 2, also at max fan. So in the end, yeah, I understand why the fan is so loud. After all, this is a very thin device with a very powerful CPU, so they do have to cool it. But I really wasn't expecting something to get almost at Steam Deck levels of noise. Okay, moving on, I spent about a week testing this device in preparation for making this review, and so let's go over my performance testing results really quickly. When it comes to lightweight stuff, obviously this can play everything no problem, but I did want to highlight that Game Boy Advance looked really nice on this display. Same thing with widescreen hacks of certain classic games like Super Mario World and the Super Nintendo, this looked awesome. I also had a good time trying out widescreen cheats and hacks with other 3D based systems like Nintendo 64 as well as Dreamcast. When it comes to playing Sega Saturn, one of the harder systems to emulate on RetroArch, it actually runs really well using the Beetle core even with a heavy-duty CRT shader. So absolutely no problem playing any of those classic systems even with an upgraded experience like widescreen or with a shader. PlayStation Portable also played really well. This is at a 4x upscale, so a 1080p resolution, and yeah, every single game played just fine. Now moving on to Gen 6, things do get a little bit more complicated, but still really easy to play. For example, with GameCube, I played everything in balanced mode, which is the power saving mode on this device, and I'm still playing it at a 3x resolution, which is beyond 1080p, and it's still looking awesome. So I think that any game that runs well on Dolphin is going to play just fine on the Pocket S. And it's the same experience with Nintendo Wii. I could play everything at a 3x resolution with no issue whatsoever. And it's a pretty similar experience with PlayStation 2. I could play most games at the balanced or power saving mode at a 2.5 or 3x resolution. So if you are looking for a very sleek PlayStation 2 experience, then I think that this is going to be pretty great. As far as compatibility, just about every PlayStation 2 game will play relatively well. There will be a few that just don't work well with Aether SX2, and the app is no longer in development. So the PS2 emulation is not going to get any better, but it's still very good. The only game that I did find some slowdown with in balanced mode was Champions of Norrath, and so this one I would recommend bumping it up to game mode just to make sure that you get better performance. Moving on, here is the most recent version of Citra before it was taken down, and it's running at full speed with a 4x resolution for Nintendo 3DS games. So as long as the game works well in the versions of Citra that we have available, it's going to play well in the Pocket S. Now, given the fact that this device is so similar to the PlayStation Vita in terms of the sleek form factor, I did want to test out some Vita games too. And this, unfortunately, is where the crack started to show when it comes to emulation. And that's because this device is just so early that it doesn't really have any good drivers available yet. And so unfortunately, when you try to load like Turnip or even the most recent Qualcomm drivers, they aren't going to work. So you'll have to use the native device drivers instead. And for many games, the onboard drivers actually worked out pretty well. Even some harder to run games like Wipeout 2048, it was actually really playable. However, I did find about half the games I tried to play were relatively unplayable, either from graphical issues or just a blank screen. And I think that makes sense given the fact that the Vita 3K emulator is still relatively recent, and so it does need more time to develop. Either way, I would say if you specifically wanted to play PS Vita on this device, it's probably not going to be a very good match. It's also a similar experience with Nintendo Switch emulation using the last version of Yuzu. This app is also not able to use the Turnip driver, so you're going to have to stick with the default ones, and it will present some issues. We'll talk about this more later when we get to our Odin 2 comparison. Before that, I did want to do some Android testing, and I found that most games played absolutely fine. I'm not super huge on Android games, but from a performance standpoint, yeah, I found no problem here. You could always push everything to the highest settings and everything would play fine. Probably the most heavyweight game that I have to test with is going to be Genshin Impact. I'm not in like the later scenes, which are going to be more demanding, but even then, when in a battle, I could play it with a 60 FPS in the high settings and it played absolutely fine. One thing of note, Call of Duty Warzone crashes during the cutscene. This is the same thing that used to happen with the Odin 2. So I'm not sure if this is something to do with the chipset or the driver or something maybe with the version of Android that AYANEO is using. Either way, unfortunately, as of making this video, yeah, this game is not playable. I also tested out remote play and streaming using various apps, and I found that all of these worked absolutely fine. By default, this device will have an Xbox-style layout, and so all the buttons are going to work accordingly. The only main limitation here is just going to be that control scheme, just because I don't find it to be a very good fit when it comes to modern games. Either way, even though I only have a 5 GHz Wi-Fi connection within my home, I had no problem streaming any of my games, at least locally. Anyway, that's a quick down and dirty performance measurement of the AYANEO Pocket S. After all, this is the most powerful Android device in the world, and so as it stands, yeah, this thing can play just about everything. Its only main limitations are going to be the drivers and just the inherent bugs that come with a new release. I think that 6 months from now, this device is going to perform even better. So now let's move into the more critical aspects of this review when I start to talk about whether or not this device is going to be worth it and some of the shortcomings that I noticed in my week of testing. And I think the first thing we should do is look over some of my summary from my previous video. This is it right here. I labeled them as green flags and red flags. Under the green flags column is going to be all the good stuff, and I think all of the good stuff that we had seen previously is still good today. The device is still very sleek and premium, but also no longer has that 1440p screen. It's now 1080p, which I think is just fine for a 6-inch display anyway. And of course, it still has lots of power, and I think it is a relatively comfortable device to hold. However, now let's look at the red flags. These are the things that bothered me about the device initially, and so I want to see if any of this has changed. We've already talked about the relatively flat experience of the ergonomics and the fact that I wish these analog sticks were upgraded. And I think when it comes to all the TBDs that we were thinking about before in terms of like the weight and the price, we know all that stuff now. So already we can kind of knock out some of those red flags, but let's talk about whether or not this device still gets warm, because this is one of my big sticking points with the AYANEO Pocket S. First and foremost, when playing most games, it's not going to get too hot internally. It's going to be about 75 to 80 degrees Celsius, which is pretty hot but not super boiling. And if we try to run a benchmark and try to push it as far as we can, I found that the absolute hottest that we get was about 89-90 degrees Celsius. So I do think that the cooling system is working in terms of at least keeping it at 90 degrees or lower. However, my big sticking point here is that the ambient heat is palpable. After just a few minutes of use, even when playing something that's relatively less demanding like PS2 or GameCube, you're going to feel some ambient heat. A lot of that is going to be concentrated in the metal band around the sides of the device, which is exactly where your hands are going to rest. In addition, you're going to feel that heat on the back of the device as well. By contrast, the Odin 2 also gets equally hot. In fact, it'll get around 90 degrees when using a benchmark. However, it's almost impossible to even feel that ambient heat when you're holding it by the grips. And for me personally, I don't like feeling the heat of a device when I'm trying to play it, and so this is something that's kind of a deal breaker for me. And this is one of the many things that I'd like to compare with the Odin 2 and the AYANEO Pocket S, given the fact that these are both kind of the top tier Android devices right now. So let's take a few minutes and go over some of these comparisons between the two, some of the things I like about the Odin 2 and maybe don't like as much with the Pocket S. Let's start with screen brightness, and I think that they are almost neck and neck. The Odin 2 is maybe slightly brighter than the other at 100%, but when it comes to the dimness factor, the Pocket S wins hands down. I'm not sure whether or not that's going to be a super important factor for you, but it is nice to see that big dynamic range. In the end, I would say the screens are very similar between these two. I play them both at about 75% brightness, and I think that's great. Now, one aspect where I think that the Odin 2 definitely shines are in those analog sticks that I mentioned before. These are also Hall sensor, but have a full wide range of motion. Not only that, it's pretty easy to remove the sticks themselves and put on new ones. In fact, there's a whole world of Etsy out there that actually has a bunch of sticks that you can add to this device. For example, the one on the left is 3D printed, and it's almost the size of a full Xbox stick, and it feels great. Meanwhile, the Joy-Con-like sticks on the Pocket S just feel kind of terrible by comparison. And given the fact that when playing a game, most of the time you're just going to be using the D-pad or the analog sticks, and both of those are better on the Odin 2, it makes it a much better experience to play games. Another thing I like about the Odin 2 is that all of the function buttons are very intuitive. We've got our start and select buttons on the top, and then we have our back button on the right, and then our home button on the left. Not only that, on the back we have two different programmable function buttons, and these can be mapped to whatever button you would like. And the software within the AYANEO Odin 2 is mature enough that they have all of that button configuration already figured out. Meanwhile, the button placement on the Pocket S feels a little bit haphazard. We've got our start and select buttons on the bottom left, which are a little bit unintuitive, but then our home button is on the top left, and I find myself pressing this accidentally from time to time. In addition, we do have a few different programmable buttons, but unfortunately the software doesn't actually allow you to program them just yet. And so while I do appreciate that we have these function buttons and they should be eventually programmable, it's just not as intuitive as they are on the Odin 2. And finally, let's do a performance comparison between the two. We're going to focus on benchmarks in this section. As a reminder, the Odin 2 has a Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 chip. That's still a very powerful chip, but it is a step down below the Pocket S. However, between the two, I found the performance to be almost neck and neck in many regards. For example, when running the Wildlife Extreme stress test, which is a 20-minute test on both devices, when I started them at the exact same time, they would finish at the exact same time as well. So let's go ahead and pick apart some of these benchmark scores. To start, I did a 1-minute Wildlife Extreme test, so this is just looking at the absolute max performance. And you can see here that yes, the Pocket S is about 10% more performant than the Odin 2. And bear in mind, I'm running this benchmark at the absolute highest performance mode with the highest fan setting on and at 50% brightness. Now things get a lot more interesting when we do the 20-minute stress test. This is going to run the same loop but 20 times over. And during that first minute, yes, the Pocket S is far ahead, but after that first minute, it starts to dip quite a bit. And by the time that we're done with the 20-minute test, the performance is actually lower than it is on the Odin 2. Meanwhile, you can see with the Odin 2, it stays at the exact same score almost the entire time, so it's got a 99.8% stability. And so even though, yes, the Pocket S does outperform the Odin 2 in the beginning, when it comes to a consistent performance, it's actually the Odin 2 that wins. The Odin 2 also does better when it comes to battery life. Now, obviously this one has a larger battery, so that is a factor, but even then, during the course of the 20-minute stress test, the Pocket S lost about twice as much battery percentage as the Odin 2. I did a couple more tests, let's run down those real quickly. I did another one using power saving mode, again at 50% brightness. And I also turned off the fan here, so it's only running off the CPU. Now with both devices, they would start to thermal throttle because obviously there's no fan or cooling. On the Pocket S, it took about 9 minutes before it started to dip, whereas on the Odin 2, it took 11 minutes. And the interesting thing here is the Odin 2 actually outperformed the Pocket S when playing in power saving mode. In the beginning, the loop score was a little bit higher, and then by the end, it's also just a tiny bit higher as well. In addition, the battery performance results were about the same, so the Odin 2 lost about half the battery percentage of the Pocket S. So not only did the Odin 2 outperform the Pocket S in this test, but it also had quite a bit better battery life as well. And then finally, I did one more test where I did the same thing but at max brightness using the max performance mode and fan as well. Now with the Pocket S, right out the gate, it was performing worse at max brightness compared to 50% brightness, and it just went down from there. In the end, it did stabilize around 3600, which is similar to what it was with 50% brightness. Meanwhile, with the Odin 2 at max brightness, it started at about the same level and did dip down a little bit more, but not by much. And even then, once it got to that 20th loop, it was still outperforming the Pocket S. And so in summary, when it comes to all these benchmarks, yes, the Pocket S is a more powerful CPU, but I think it comes down to basically splitting hairs. In the end, both of these devices can play anything that Android can, be that emulators or games, with absolutely no problem. It's almost like the performance on these devices have kind of just removed that performance aspect from the whole equation. If they both can play everything under the sun, what does it matter if one is a little bit more powerful than the other? And of course, I did find it interesting that in terms of benchmarks, the Odin 2 basically won every time. One interesting note when it comes to battery life, between 50% and max brightness, I found that there wasn't a big difference between the two. There was a 2% drop in battery when it came to the Pocket S and only 1% with the Odin 2. And so if you want to play it at max brightness, I think that the battery life is still going to be pretty great. Now the last performance note I wanted to make between the Pocket S and the Odin 2 has to do with those drivers that we were mentioning before. In particular, when it comes to Nintendo Switch emulation, being able to use those third-party turnip drivers is a really big deal. There are going to be some games that play just fine with the default Qualcomm drivers, but I found those to be pretty few and far between. For the vast majority of the other games, you're going to find all sorts of graphical issues. Maybe it's going to be a little bit too dark in some spaces, or maybe it'll just have a lot of glitching, or maybe you won't see the screen at all. But when it comes down to it, one of my favorite things about the Odin 2 is how good it is when it comes to Nintendo Switch emulation, and those turnip drivers are a really big deal in that regard. I basically treat my Odin 2 like an additional Switch where I'm able to play all my retro games and then also Switch games at the same time. And until we get better support on the chipset found in the Pocket S, it's going to be a pretty big difference between the two, especially when you consider the fact that development on the Yuzu emulator has stopped. So from a development standpoint, the emulator itself is not going to get any better. So we are working on diminishing returns at this point, and drivers are the thing that are really going to push it forward. So this may be just a temporary issue right now, but it is something, at least in this week of testing, that really held me back from enjoying this device as much as I would like to. Now, I've been throwing a lot of data at you, both for the Pocket S as well as the Odin 2, so let's wrap it up and talk about some of the things where the Pocket S is better and some of the other things where the Odin 2 is better. Because like I said, when it comes to the high-end Android space, it's basically going to be one or the other. For the Pocket S, there are a few things that are unique. Number one, I think that it's very sleek and premium. I also like that it doesn't have a screen bezel. It looks really sharp. Also, compared to the Odin 2, this is a lighter and more portable device, and it also has more raw power, at least on paper. However, when it comes to just about every other aspect, I would prefer the Odin 2. It's got better analog sticks and a better D-pad. It also has a larger battery by 33%. The software and the drivers on it are also more mature, and I did find that within benchmarking, the performance was more consistent on the Odin 2. In addition, it has a quieter fan and less ambient heat, which makes it easier to hold and play. And the audio overall is better on this too. It has front-firing speakers and then also a headphone jack. It also is more ergonomic, which means I can play it for longer sessions, and I also like the intuitive approach of the function buttons. In addition, the Odin 2 is quite a bit cheaper. It's $300 for the low-end retail version compared to the early bird version of the Pocket S, which is $100 more. So between the two, yes, I prefer the Odin 2. I think that the Pocket S is still a very good device, especially if you want something very sleek and premium. However, in just about every other respect, I would prefer to play on my Odin 2. Now, if you are looking for something a little bit smaller than the Odin 2, they just started announcing the Odin 2 Mini. This is going to come in both a white and black form factor, and it's also going to have the same Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 processor. Bear in mind, this has a smaller battery. It's 5,000 milliamp hours compared to 8,000, but I still think that's going to give you plenty of battery life on this ARM-based chip. Also of note, the screen is different on this one. It's only 5 inches, but it is mini LED. I'm really looking forward to testing that. And also, as of making this video, they just announced the pricing. It's going to be $340 for the low-end model or $399 for the high-end one. That means that this device is going to cost the same as the early bird model of the Pocket S. Either way, I'm always happy to see more options in the market, so I'm pretty excited about this one, and be sure to tune in when I make other videos about it. So let's start wrapping up and talking about whether or not I think that the AYANEO Pocket S is going to be worth it for you. And here's the way I see it. An expensive handheld should justify its higher price point. And I think in some ways, the AYANEO Pocket S price is justified. After all, it has a top-of-the-line chip, and it's also a gorgeous engineering marvel. However, I couldn't help but think that every small disappointment with this device, from its underwhelming controls to its ambient heat to the loud fan and the bad ergonomics, all of these little setbacks feel that much more of a letdown when you think about how much it costs, especially when you compare it to cheaper and more satisfying options that are already on the market right now. At the very least, I think that a $400+ handheld should be an absolute pleasure to use. But unfortunately, due to a couple different factors, including the flat ergonomics and the ambient heat, I found myself playing this device in just a few short bursts instead of all the time. So if you're asking whether or not I recommend the Pocket S, I would say it only makes sense if you want the very best performance and sleekest form factor, and you're willing to live with all the sacrifices that AYANEO made along the way. It's certainly a beautiful handheld, but I would say it's one that looks better than it actually feels. In other words, the Pocket S was a fun distraction over the past week of testing, but it'll likely live on a shelf for the foreseeable future. Who knows, maybe some driver updates will make it a little bit more enticing, but as it stands right now, the Odin 2 is going to be the Android device that I continue to throw in my everyday carry bag. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Does the sleek form factor of the Pocket S justify this high price point, or is it going to be worth getting something else? As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we'll see you next time. Happy gaming.